in front of me with reading. I took a lot of shortcuts trying to kind of get to content while kind of passing over a lot of the skills they might need. At the same time, I learned that, you know, a lot of the reasons that we kind of prevent kids with disabilities or other type of kind of barriers to learning is through the way that we present the information. And oftentimes that, especially in science, I think when you look at our science materials, the heavy emphasis on text and the very complex levels of text often kind of eliminate or depress the ability for students to access that. So I'm going to start by really talking a little bit just about the characteristics. I'm not sure how familiar people are with this population, so I thought I would kind of, you know, do a little bit just to talk about kids who are incarcerated, what that means. And I think the easiest way to do that is to just kind of talk about a couple of studies that I've done with this population. So the information I'm going to share with you now, it's pretty typical. It's not from this state, and this state, Massachusetts, is pretty similar though in most ways, and I'll just kind of touch on that a little bit. But so this was a study I did where we did assessments using the Woodcock-Johnson test of achievement, and we did reading, a subset of reading batteries, and we did math batteries. And we also interviewed the kids about their experiences. Each kid sort of had about a 2-hour interview. And so we did this with 555 youth. The mean age of them was about 17 years, which is pretty typical in juvenile settings. And also typical is, you know, these settings are primarily comprised of kids of color. I mean, there are a lot of reasons that go into that, but in the end, you know, this is ends up to be who's there. And in this, they're also predominantly male. We have done work with females in these settings, but they're so very few. So in this state, you know, all of these data are for males. The female system was only 22 girls at the time. And it was a totally separate setting. So we didn't really collect data from them in my work. And just kind of to give a sense of disability, so I'm a special educator. This is from that same population of students. On the right side shows the percentage of enrollment of kids with disabilities in the state. So the total was 12.9%. And here are the sort of the largest categories of kids with disabilities, and you can see their relative percents in the state. And you see here what's pretty shocking is we just have substantially higher percentages of kids with emotional disturbance. So in a facility, this is 19% of that population, while in the state, it's just about 1%. Same thing with kids with learning disabilities, about 12% of the kids in the facility, while just about 4% in the state. So you see substantially higher numbers. And in total, 45% of those students had special education identified disabilities, as compared to 13% in the state. This is also a kind of a gross underestimate. While these numbers might seem pretty shocking, the only way at the time that this study was done, the only way to determine whether somebody had a disability was that they came with a school record that indicated that they were in special education. And in a lot of the data that we had, many of these kids hadn't been going to school for 1 or 2 years. They actually weren't coming from a school. They didn't have a record. But when we talked to them about their prior experience, whether they thought they had a disability, this number was substantially higher. And in this state, it's actually 65% of the kids, so 2/3 of the students have have been identified with special education needs. So a dramatically different population than what we would see in a typical school. Just another thing, and this matters a lot, I think, when you know, we think about the experience that kids have in school. We interviewed these students about their, had they ever been suspended, had they ever been expelled from school. And again, I'm going to say our data are generally pretty conservative. The only time that we sort of marked that yes, they were suspended was not only that they could say they had been suspended, but they had to be able to tell us when the first time they were suspended was. They had to be able to tell us what they were suspended for. So they actually had to provide a fair amount of detail, or we didn't count that. We wanted to be as conservative as possible, but our, the indications of kids who said, yeah, I had been suspended, but couldn't give us kind of the details we were requesting was 99%. And a huge number, 51%, also had been expelled. So this, as educators, I mean, this really means out of school for the rest of the year. So all this means is that these are kids who've also experienced a fair amount of time out of school, right? So they're being kind of excluded from school for various reasons. These other being that a lot of these kids aren't attending school. So this was a question of when you were arrested, had you been attending school, and had you been attending school regularly in the last year? And 42% of those kids said they did not. They had not been attending school regularly. So not only do we have this kind of discipline exclusion, but we also seen kids who just are not going to school. Interestingly, so about 27% of the kids stated that they dropped out, so they had dropped out of school. But if you're not familiar with like what dropout means in most districts and in this state for certain, to drop out, you must formally sign out. You must have like documentation to do this. So if you just stop going to school and never return, the district doesn't categorize you as a dropout. For these kids, we were kind of surprised a higher percentage had not been going, and they hadn't been going for a while. But they also, when we asked them if you dropped out, and you would say, well, you haven't been attending school for like 6 months, are you dropping out? And they would, that group, a small group would say, no, I'm not dropping out. I want to finish school. I just haven't been going. And then a pretty substantial percentage, 64, had been retained, right? So held back a year in school. And then a substantial percentage of the kids had been in alternative settings. So these are alternative schools for kids who had disciplinary problems. And again, the issues that these bring to the fore are a lot of time away from high quality instruction, right? So it's not only do they have kind of a number of disabilities, et cetera, they also just have been, had huge gaps in their time in school, whether this is through kind of their own kind of not attending, whether it's being placed in alternative placements where they don't have good educational instruction, or whether they've been kind of forced out through discipline systems. So as I said, we also did, we kind of assessed them, the Woodcock-Johnson, and what we found was also interesting. So the mean here, so this, if you're not familiar with this, the mean for the assessment, the normative mean is 100 with a standard deviation of 15, consistent with the IQ test. But the mean here was 81.1, so more than a standard deviation below the expected mean for the age of students. But the interesting thing was that like it's a pretty normal curve, right? Like it wasn't as though there are a lot of kids who are kind of at the high end and we're seeing just a distribution and maybe it's skewed. It looks pretty normal, which again was this kind of indication that the population of kids as a whole are sort of different from kind of the typical learner. And the same with math. Oh, that was math, sorry. This is the math calculation score. This is their reading. So this is passage comprehension. So it's their reading comprehension score. And again, not quite as low, but still, standard deviation below the mean. And relatively regular, and we just don't see, I think the key is we don't see a huge number of kids up here, but we do see some, right? So it's not to say that all these kids are poor readers, which later I'll kind of convey as kind of a critical issue when trying to teach in these settings. And just to put this in context, what I basically did is found a grade level equivalent for the mean performance of the kids in the setting. So this is kind of the overall mean reading level. So again, if you know reading, this is pretty low level for a 17-year-old. The Great Barrier Reef is one of the great wonders of the natural world, but this is relatively simple language that kids are able to sort of decode. When we look at the special education students who are in here, it's substantially, when we looked at what's their mean reading level, and then we took a passage of that equivalent grade level, it's substantially lower. We had a big party on my street last weekend. We didn't have to dress up or bring presents. And when we contrast that with a science text, so this was pulled from a high school science text that was in one of the facilities. It wasn't being used, but this was one of the texts they had. And then we did a grade equivalent, and this was about 12.9 or so grade equivalent. So it's high grade level. But you can see the difference here. Like if you're trying to access content via text, right? The level of this text really cannot be accessed in any way by the student whose reading skills are at this level. And then it gets compounded by, of course, the high numbers of vocabulary words that are needed just to understand this concept, right? So the complexity of the language is quite advanced. I'm sorry if I keep looking away. I'm running two of these because I can never see where I'm going next, so I have it on a separate computer. So just kind of my work around that was that, as I said, the learners in juvenile justice settings have substantial disabilities. And I've worked closely with kids in these settings for years. They're pronounced. These are kind of kids who really have some pretty serious disabilities, and they haven't gotten the necessary services to sort of counter that. So they don't have skills to sort of work around some of their deficits. By virtue of just, discipline, not attending school, being placed in other settings, they lack kind of adequate educational experiences. And this in science, I think, is more critical than anything, because as they lose kind of basic understanding of science, terms, science concepts, even just sort of general information about like scientific thinking, they really have a hard time accessing the sort of science, not just the content specific, but sort of science in general. And I didn't present on this. I realized I have a limited time, but I did some work around their kind of interest in education, their interest in reading, and my own personal experience just working with kids is they generally view education as extremely important, right? And most kids would articulate, I need to get my high school diploma, like that is my ticket, right? That's what you need to do to get a good job, or I want to go to college. So they care about it, but they just don't have the skills kind of to do this work. And so my thinking around this was like, as I was trying to figure out how to work within these settings to kind of improve science education, it really was that the educational environment needed to be built in ways that were very different from what's currently there. And the way I did it, I'll kind of walk a little bit next, was I kind of worked with kids who were either had been in the juvenile system or were kids with very similar profiles who were in alternative schools, and working on science activities with them and trying to figure out like what is the best way to get them interested, engaged in learning science. And so that was kind of my thing. I thought what I need to learn is I need to learn how to teach effectively from the learners themselves, right? Not to take some pedagogical approach and stick it in and say, here's how to do it. And I don't think, one thing I forgot to say at the beginning, and I apologize, if you've never been in a juvenile facility, they have classes, right? It's like a school. I mean, I would say it's a school, but they don't typically have resources. In this state, for example, most of these facilities have very, very small rooms. They're pretty bare. They're sort of concrete. They are allowed to have books. They're not allowed to have any equipment. They don't have any science equipment. So there's no ability to sort of do any tests or experiments. Everything they would do would be read. And most of them, most of the teachers basically just give worksheets day after day, right? This is what science instruction looks like. And it's a mix of they're kind of challenged with what they can do, but also like most of the science, there were only two science teachers in this state who were actually certified science teachers. So they're just another teacher who gets put into teaching science. And so they would openly say, I don't really understand it. I'm just trying to, we read it and I try to grade their papers, but it's really worksheet based work, which, I think we would all agree is just, it's not really science. It's just kind of content, some content mastery with some worksheets to test whether or not I've learned anything. So I just want you to I'm just going to show quickly some images. So these are the kids I worked with over I guess it was about 3 years. Part of the time was struggling just to get a program running, but we really tried to do sort of experiential science learning with kids who were either out of school, dropped out of school, or were in an alternative education setting because of disciplinary issues. And so you can see, we did a lot of work. We live in Western Mass, so sort of going out to experience sort of the ecosystems that we live in was a big part of this, and getting kids out of their kind of sort of urban setting, which most of them hadn't really left. Many of these kids were actually fearful to walk into the woods, which took us some time. I remember our first day, we were just walking through, it was probably a 30-foot wide trail, like not like in the woods, but like through the woods. And like half of the kids are like, I'm not going in there. And so, we spent some time really trying to kind of counter that work. These are just some faces of the kids. This is in our van where we would take our trips. I think the things that I'm always kind of focused on are like, we have tons and tons of pictures, but I think the sense of this isn't typically how these kids look in their classrooms. I mean, when we'd walk in their school, like they don't look happy, they don't look engaged. So here we were doing some horticulture work. Here we were doing some caving. We were exploring like what organisms live inside of caves, right? Like what is a cave and what sort of experience is this? And again, my thing that I kind of focused on each time as we would kind of take pictures is like how often I would see this happening, where like whoever was talking, whatever was happening, just kind of seeing this like attention to that. Here we were doing some, again, we did a lot of scavenger hunts to identify different types of organisms, and I would just kind of travel around, and this is where we started using iPads, because the students would actually take pictures on an iPad, which at the time it was that they were new tools, but that's how we would do the scavenger hunt. So they would really go take a picture, and then we would come back and they would present and talk about what it was they found, and we tried to classify it. Here's some more, I think, kind of typical this kind of engineering structures thing. We had a long project with this, so you can see some kids working on kind of building these structures. And again, I like this picture because it sort of has this iPad again. And this was when iPads, again, these are very new at the time, but they started to develop some science apps, right? There are little games that you can play. And so all we had on these were those, right? So you could go and like, if you wanted to take a break, you could go do a little structure game, or you could go do a little biology game, or you could go do a little math game. And the idea was just to get kids to I can take a break from what I'm doing, but the main way I'll do it is to engage in some other sort of STEM related activity. These are just more pictures of kids kind of in the environment. Here is a kid who's kind of finished his structure. that activity went to, right, they built these small bridges, and then they were like, we want to build a larger bridge. This was one that they kind of went and explored a bunch of bridges across the city, and were taking pictures of them and trying to kind of figure out like what made a good bridge. And then they really, like, in retrospect, I often think I can't believe I did some of this, but then they were like, we want to go build a bridge that goes across a river. So we did this, which involved, you know, kind of extensive amount of kind of planning, think about what we were doing, et cetera. But again, the idea was like, this was their plan. They really wanted to do this. And while this was a different type of kind of engineering, at least we were still engaged in kind of this notion of what would need to happen in order to do this, and like, were we successful? And they were able to. I mean, they're able to build this bridge. I mean, I hope you don't think it was like me and kids out there. We had people who really, these two guys really knew what they were doing, and with very little money or support, I'd coerce them. Hey, come on, you know, can you help me out? And so we had a good team of kind of experts who would kind of consistently be helping support this work. And I had one of my doctoral students was kind of doing a qualitative study at the time on just kind of the kids' experiences, like what was happening to them, what did they think, and particularly about science. And I think as this was going on, we were having a harder and harder time working in the school. The school didn't like us being there. The school was kind of averse to the way we were doing things. We had agreements that if the kid attended our program, it would account for a missed an absence, right? So kids accrued absences, and then they wouldn't be able to pass to the next grade. So they were kind of against that. And so we sort of moved ourselves away from the school. We kept the kids. But here's one of the statements from it's a pseudonym, Katrina. But we were, you know, I started to become shocked at some of these statements. So here, I would definitely consider a career in science. I want to be a paleontologist, you know, someone who gets to study fossils. I think that would be the best job to have. I was shocked to hear this, right? Like, you know, and I knew that kids were engaged, and new kids were kind of involved in what we were doing, but I just did not expect, you know, statements like this. And the fact that she knew what a paleontologist was, I was sort of like, okay, so this, you know, things are happening here that are kind of beyond what we even thought. And then another student, Josh, science in school is pretty boring. We just get lots of paperwork. I don't really feel like I learn anything from it. But when I come here, I feel different. It is educational and fun at the same time. And I think this was kind of the thing we're trying to hit on. Like, if you could get kids engaged in learning, right? They were really interested in learning. And if you force them to sort of do worksheets, et cetera, which was what's happening in juvenile systems, that really didn't happen. So for me, the big takeaways, sorry. Making sure I don't lose my track of where I am here. And I have, and the one problem with Zoom is everybody's photos are always in the place of everything. Okay. So these were kind of my takeaways, is that I just kind of came away thinking the students were engaged, motivated, and inquisitive. It wasn't what like the teachers at the school were saying about them. They aren't interested in learning. They're only here because they have to be here. And they didn't reflect the deficits that traditionally defined them, right? So that despite the challenges they were having when we were engaged in kind of learning, they were participating, they were engaged. And for those activities which we really had outcomes, like they were being successful in this work. And so I started to view this as that what was happening was a real denial of access to kind of meaningful and engaging learning. That was kind of where I went. So all of this was, you know, this whole time had been, how do we do science in juvenile correction? So it was almost like a detour for 3 years, really, to figure out, like, how can we do this? Because we're back to now worksheets and you know, reading textbooks. And so the two things that happened was I realized no matter what, we weren't getting kids out of the facility, right? They're incarcerated. They don't let them go on ecological explorations. It's just not something that's going to happen. they aren't going to have science equipment. It's just not going to happen, no matter what you say. Even now, we have we're working with tablets, and we've been in a battle about whether or not they can use stylus, the like Apple Pencil or not, and they're like, it's a weapon. Like, well, they have a pencil, right? Like, well, that pencil is, this is more of a weapon than a pencil. Okay, and we've managed to work through these. I mean, their issues are around security, and I don't question that. I mean, I've worked closely with these folks for years, and I certainly understand where they're coming from. But at the same time, the priority on security is often interfering with kind of education. And so when we started this project, I thought, okay, like this tablet can be like, somehow we can figure out how to do this work and to get away from textbooks and worksheets. And I'm not going to walk through the whole history of this, because when this project started, the idea was iBooks was also sort of new, and iBooks Author had come out, which meant, and I'm not sure if you're familiar, but you could make your own ebooks. And I thought, this is the key. Like, we make these ebooks, and we can put videos in the ebooks, and we can have kind of quizzes in the ebooks. And what quickly we learned was, oh, but we can't get anything off of the ebook. There's no data system. We can't we can't analyze everything. The only thing you could do is go and look at the actual kid's tablet, like, which wasn't at all what we were hoping to do. And so within this project, so this RAISE project was an NSF project that we're just completing now. We kind of had to retool, and it brought me into the world of computer science, where I just realized we couldn't do this through like a typical ebook. I needed to get, I started hiring undergraduate computer programmers and saying, look, here, I have this idea of what we want to do. It should be like this. Can we do it? And so that next sort of 4 years was just spent trying to build the system that is what I'll show you now. But the idea was, can we bring something akin to sort of inquiry science into a setting where they don't have any supports, materials, services, et cetera. And they also don't have the internet. So everything that we build has to be on an enclosed system, right? So our app must be everything. They're never going to be able to go online. So we can't rely on any kind of existing internet-based resources. This brings us to the kind of challenge of juvenile corrections, and it's now getting back to this initial bit of information. One thing that's very unique about juvenile corrections is, just imagine each bar here is a kid, and this is the time they enter. This is when they're incarcerated, and this is the time they leave. Unlike a typical school, on September 1st, everybody doesn't show up. And then on whatever, June 20th, everybody is done. Kids arrive because they've been incarcerated, right? So they've been adjudicated to be delinquent, and they've been sentenced by a judge to go here. Right. So every kid comes at, almost never would you see a couple of kids arrive at the same day. Right. And their lengths of stay different. Some are shorter, right? Some are longer. Now I'm kind of taking those reading skills that we had talked about. And I'm just going to say, okay, here we see some kids are kind of in this average reading range. A substantial group are kind of low average, some are below average, and some are very low, right? So now we start seeing, okay, not only are we kind of having some troubles with our kids arrive whenever and they leave whenever, right? I'm just a teacher, and any day I might have a new kid come to my class. And now they're probably the most heterogeneous group of readers that exists anywhere. Then let's add on these disabilities that we saw. So we have kids with ADHD, we have kids with emotional behavior disorders. Some of these kids are the same kids. We have kids who have learning disabilities, right? So now you're getting a sense of this is not learning that we typically kind of think about. And this isn't a classroom that we would ever actually say, oh, let's go teach in. Not only that, they also all have different levels of credits. Some of them don't have any high school credits, so effectively they're an 8th grade student. Some of them have some credits in 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th, and then a pretty substantial, what in this state's called a high set, but it's the GED, the equivalency degree. So you know, I'm just trying to create a picture of like how complex does this group get, right? And so here is what we would call our class, right? So it creates all sorts of complications when we figure out like what is it how are we going to instruct this group of kids? Because as a teacher, if I have my semester here, right, I only have some kids who are here the whole time. I have some kids who, right, really never even overlap. Right, so it's kind of a monumental challenge around like how do we do this? And the things that we really tackled were, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with this notion of universal design for learning, but that became kind of our fundamental approach to this was, because of all of these different needs, we must create something that's as accessible to everybody as possible, right? So, you know, and we kind of have these were our primary questions. So does this UDL and PBIS is just project-based inquiry science. So, so does a UDL PBIS biology program improve outcomes? Does it improve their science practices, right, from the NGSS, these kind of 8 core practices? And does it increase their level of STEM interest and STEM engagement, right? So our curriculum, so we developed a curriculum. It's a part of a curriculum. It's 6 weeks. So it's kind of a central unit. We didn't do a whole year. Mostly we were trying to build the system and kind of use the content to help us kind of design that. But these were our kind of practices, the disciplinary core ideas across kind of concepts from the NGSS standards. And that's not all of them, but I'm just kind of showing you, like, we developed this starting there, saying, okay, we're going to look at those standards. That's going to be the place that we define what our curriculum is. And at the time, the NGSS was starting, but we were still in our kind of same, the state curriculum frameworks, which were quite different from the NGSS. And then our other piece was we had a challenge with teachers. And so when I tell you what instruction, like, this is what I watched in every class in one setting, one day as instruction. So this was like, every kid was given this, and it was write as many 4-letter or more words, using letters from deoxyribonucleic acid, right? What does this have to do with science? Nothing. What are the outcomes the students are getting? Nothing. But this is what the class was that day. And I'm not joking. Like, this is all they did. They didn't have anything else going on. It was like, this was it. And, I sort of asked the teacher, why did he do that? What was he thinking about? And this was one of the teachers he wasn't a science person. And he just said, I just don't know what to do. Like, the kids are so bored of read the textbook, and I just don't understand science. So I thought this would be fun. I'm thinking, oh boy, like, and I watched the kids who were just like, oh, and then he sort of kept saying, if you get X number of words, you'll get these canteen points, so they could go get a snack. And so that was and he would keep saying that in an effort to kind of motivate the kids to complete it. Nonetheless, right, not what we would hope is happening with kind of good science instruction. And then what we did sort of to start was we then kind of went through the textbook that they were using, and we made a matrix where we just aligned the textbook to the NGSS standards, and we just basically cut out everything that wasn't aligned to those standards. And this was also pretty surprising for us, how much information here just was not actually, it was viewed important by somebody, and particularly important by the textbook writers. But from our perspective, which was we needed kids to master this, what was in the NGSS, this was what was important. It really had just a lot of extraneous information that's, I'd hope I'm not sounding critical to like people who are writing textbooks, because I think an advanced learner where this is giving them more detail and more rich experience, great. But these are kids who are struggling just to get the basic concept. And this just looks, from that perspective, to be kind of interference, right? It's hard for them to even figure out what am I supposed to take out of here. So that was kind of phase one, and we kind of then restarted our text from there. And so then we were stuck with this kind of question: how do we use technology to solve instructional challenges? And the approach we took was to do this co-design and co-creation. So we, as opposed to, I think there's this kind of squiggle model, which is kind of a unidirectional curriculum development idea where we kind of go through and learn and learn and learn and learn, and we refine until we get kind of to a really, knowing what we are doing, and we develop. But it doesn't actually incorporate feedback in throughout the process. It usually says, let's take something on and get feedback. Our model, and a co-design model that we adopted, was that everything we did from day one, we were taking out to kids and teachers, getting feedback and using it to help us figure out what should be in here. So everything was still aligned to the content standards, but when we proposed, for instance, a way to do a lesson, or we wrote some assessments, we ran those by kids, we ran them by teachers. As we got more involved in the technology, every time we developed something, we took it out to the kids, and they would give feedback. We would come back to our team, we would revise it, we would take it back out to those kids. And we did that for 2 years, and we were out twice a week in 2 different facilities, just endlessly taking information and getting information, and also doing a lot of observation of just what was happening in there. And I apologize, I'm going to kind of have to rush through a bit of this. I try to figure out how much to show and what I can show, and especially because it's a tablet system, it's sort of like screenshotting and things like that. But one of the first things we did was to say, kids really didn't understand, they didn't understand what ecosystems were in general, and it was hard for them to even gather it. When you looked at the book, it just you would read it and you would learn some facts, and then you hope that the kids absorb that. And what instead we tried to do was create a nonlinear environment, what we call the ecosystem explorer. And the idea was, instead of just presenting them with information, we did a lot of things like they would do a scavenger hunt to search for certain types of things, right? So go find abiotic factors. And so they would explore this ecosystem environment by, and I'll show you the navigation process. And the idea was, instead of sort of a direct instruction model, it was set up some tasks and have them explore, and trying to at least recreate what we could do when we could take kids out into the environment, right? So in the last piece about this, when I talk about no needs to close the system, and I'll show you this a little before, we first tried to do the ebooks, as I said, and one of the challenges was when we thought, oh, we'll find like an app that we could download that might be an interesting add-on to help explore a certain thing. The kids just got confused and lost, and they're like, I have to close this down, and then I open this up, and they would get, so if they were working on an activity, they were supposed to answer a question, they had to leave one thing, go to another one, come back, and particularly as kids with disabilities, were just like, I'm just confused. I don't understand what I'm supposed to do here, which was part of our reason for saying we need one application. And so what I'll show you is everything we built was in this one system. You never left. In fact, it's in something called single app mode. So you open up the app, that's all you have throughout the process. And we built some mini games and some things that are fun in there that come up, but all of it is in one system. So you never close that system out. So it looks like this, and I'll show you some different walkthroughs and explorations. But essentially, like the way this started was we picked 4 right here. There's 3. We also added Boston as a 4th ecosystem, and kids would go here, and it would take them to Madagascar, and you would be able to navigate around there. From there, you could go visit organisms, and so it sort of did this type of approach. So if I went to the Serengeti, it would take me to a Serengeti page. I could do this look around, which lets me look at multiple pictures in the Serengeti. In there, I see organisms with also little buttons, and I can click on any of them. In every ecosystem, there's a video, there's the food web, there's facts about that. And so I can explore the ecosystem, but I can also explore into each organism. And I can do that in multiple ways. So for instance, I can look at a food web that's here for this particular organism or this ecosystem. And then I could navigate through here by like, I could go to the giraffe from here, I could go to the lion from here, as well as from those kind of pictures in the ecosystem. And that would then take me to their food chain. I can go from the food chain to a different organism. So the idea was I could keep exploring different levels of this, including like at the giraffe page, I have some basic facts. There's videos, there's sort of these, and I'll show you a couple of these videos. But the idea is kids sort of start to explore this, and we didn't load this down with tons of information. Again, our idea here wasn't we were trying to get them to be experts on an organism, but rather to understand ecosystems and how organisms interacted with that ecosystem. What is an ecosystem? And you'll see towards the end of here, when we get to like, what is the science they're doing? This becomes important really around understanding the relationships among organisms, which is kind of our central kind of issue here, particularly when things disrupt ecosystems. What can you do about it, right? Which is kind of the scientific challenge here. I'm just going to show a quick, sorry, I've got to move everybody's picture again. I think the volume on this is pretty low. So, so every organism, for instance, had these very short, we just called these observation videos. So it was just looking at organisms in the wild. And so we had a team, you know, I was shocked at how long these things took and how difficult it was to find content for this. We luckily had, I don't know if you're familiar with the Planet Earth series, but like they, you know, we had to pay a pretty penny, but they allowed us to use that and modify it to fit in here. So they were extremely supportive of that work. But it was really difficult just to create those. So for every organism, there's these little videos. Again, you'll hear David Attenborough here if you know.
Individually, the algae are tiny, but together they produce 3/4 of all the oxygen in our atmosphere. Krill, shrimp-like creatures. By weight, they're the most abundant animals on the planet.
I'm just going to kind of lower this down, the volume down a bit. So the idea here was like, again, our approach was how do we use media to kind of teach some of these concepts that previously they were seeing as like text, right? So this is just really teaching energy transfer and understanding it in a way that's visual, right? So we just keep seeing, right, from, you know, we go from algae to krill to fish, you'll see seals. And each of these, again, were kind of run by kids. So we started with some, we would revise them, we'd bring them back. And we kind of came to this one, I think is one of our longer videos, but really at 2 minutes, the kids were like, it's not a, it's, they were done, right? And so it was like, we got to condense this information. And I think it really was just their ability to sort of pull in and synthesize information was really limited, right? And so we couldn't do like a 10-minute video, they wouldn't pay attention. So we had to get these short, and instead of long videos, we just kept doing, you know, short video after short video after short video. So they had no problem with that. Yeah, they of course all love that the shark comes up and gets that. But this then gives us, you know, we have now kind of a food chain that we could talk about, and then we were able to model this food chain in ways that are related to this video. So next, when we have a tool like called the energy pyramid, we aren't just sort of acting in the abstract. We can kind of get them right back to, look, this video is here. You can go right back to that and watch that. And the kids, the strange thing is, so we have been working with girls as we do this development work. The boys they're all fine with this. The girls were just fascinated, and they're like, this is amazing. Like each time they're like, oh, have you ever seen like how a lion hunts? And we're like, wow, you know, I don't know why that why that difference, but they definitely were much more kind of interested in this kind of aspect of like how energy transfer really occurs. And then what we did around each organism, we sort of storyboarded out each organism from this, what we call the health story. So we sort of went and found like what's their current like status in terms of their vulnerability. We give a little bit of overview. We talk about the threats. And this idea is the whole thing of our whole driving purpose here is how do you use science to take action to solve an ecological problem? And so every organism, again, has one of these videos. And I think I've got one here. Yeah, so I'm just going to turn that volume down again. So again, I just kind of chose the giraffe here, but this sort of does the same thing where you start to walk through, right, kind of a more narrative story, right? So it's not that observation video. This actually comes with a narration and with subtitles, etc. So again, the idea is how to get kids thinking and kind of experiencing things as opposed to just reading about it or looking at a picture. Sorry. Okay, so the last kind of, you know, and I'm just going to then show you some tools. This last way, just the whole system operates, which is the left side became, we kind of viewed it as like, well, we're still doing a little bit of their textbook and workbook. The left side was really the content, all information, everything that's kind of they're learning about is on the left side, and the right side is what the students do. So here's an example of a scavenger hunt that I'd mentioned where they would navigate through the ecosystem explorer. Here on the lower left would be there's a video about carrying capacity in an ocean ecosystem, and this is kind of a open-ended response page. This is a drag and drop, and here's a, we also have a piece on STEM career, so we also embedded a STEM career piece, so I'll talk a little bit about that. But again, this is sort of a drag and drop activity, and on the left side is that explorer system. And then a big piece that we had to build, and I think these exist elsewhere. I think these are certainly a challenge to do, was to create, and I'll just play this. For the ecosystems that we found and we were exploring, we then created simulations of those. So we identified what the organisms were that we were going to kind of monitor. We have a particular, like in this one, this was a very specific thing about the Channel Island foxes, which are on this small couple of islands off the coast of California, and they just about went extinct. And the reason was DDT was used, you know, for some time. It, if you're not familiar with DDT, it affected like the shell thickness of bald eagles, which is kind of why we got like this massive drop off in bald eagles. Well, it turns out that the bald eagles were kind of doing a couple things because they were on the islands. There were, I'm going to pause that here. Because they were on the island, golden eagles are basically just, you know, they don't go anywhere the bald eagles are because it's like they are afraid of them, essentially. I mean, they never go there. A bald eagle, if it's got a territory, you won't see golden eagles there. Well, once the bald eagles left, the golden eagles came in. The golden eagles were eating the foxes. So we saw this strange DDT affects one thing, but it actually is affecting this channel fox. So that's kind of what that simulation, and that's just pretty much a data collection simulation, right? All we see there is the DDT, you tap it, and you see kind of an outcome, right? So you're not interacting with this in any way. And then what you can then do is, right, so then you can always go at any time to graphically see this. You're just watching here, like you can scroll in and scroll out, you can scroll up and scroll down. You can touch any point on the graph and it will kind of show you that, right? This is that information. Let me pause that a second so you, right, so anything, I'll go back a little bit so you see a different one that's, right, so it'll show you how many, what's the count, put that little icon. We do a lot of this kind of this UDL notion, color syncing, icon syncing. So here's the golden eagle, and here's the time frame, right? So after 72 ticks, So you can kind of, there's lots of ways to kind of read the data and understand the data. And every time they make a graph, it also gets saved into the system so that they can pull it up and use it later. And I'll kind of talk a little bit about that. I don't know how I'm doing on time. Okay, I think I'm good. So this is now the next level. So you can see now what happens is you actually have a lot more things that you can interact with. So in the way this is brought about is they keep learning more about the story, right? So we aren't just exposing them to this, they're learning a new piece of the story on that left side. And then as they learn more, right, they start to realize they can do some various interventions, and they can try to figure out if they can come up with a solution to fix the problem with the channel fox. Right, and so on this one, it takes a while. I mean, it's really, you have to kind of do a number of steps and get them in sequence. And I'm going to fast forward a bit, but you can get a point to where you've sort of returned back to what the kind of expected original sort of ecosystem was. And the idea here is then I would present, like, here's my idea what I would do. I tested it out in the simulation, etc. And again, it's just showing kind of the similar things there. So when we got to these kind of issues of like, how do we get, how do we pull information from kids? We really had, we wanted to develop a number of types of assessments that were also engaging, easy to use, et cetera. But we wanted to kind of make sure these were UDL. And so we did around kind of these formative pieces, we were pretty successful. So here, for instance, this is the STEM career. So this is just choosing, right? So it's very simple. It's like, okay, I'm not being asked to look at a long list. I just get shown something. I can pick one way or the other, right? A very easy type of, anytime there's a binary decision, we could apply this tool as opposed to doing like a true false, right? And it's just a more interactive way to do that. And after they do this, the kids, you'll see their answers. They could also go and change those. And in the back end, we track all of this. So we know if they've changed them, we know their original response, we know if they've modified that and done a different response later. We have a drag and drop tool. So this actually is integrated with that last tool. So these are now those same jobs that they chose, and now I can kind of rate them, most important, important, or less important. And again, it's just a different way of acting. And I'll be honest, this tactile nature to the kids is really something that does kind of matter to them, right? It is different from them than kind of just putting a page, writing something down on a page. And they're sort of integrated. So what I'm showing you here is you can then take answers from one spot and apply them into another spot, right? So now it's like, okay, here are the answers you chose, right? Now we're asking you to kind of rank these. And you can do this in kind of any type of format, but there's a lot of flexibility. And here you see, oh, I'm going to actually add new things to this. I come to the next page again. So in the back end of it, it's really just tracking and storing all student data so that, oh, I think it didn't take it to the last page, but you can now go back, and what I changed there would change in the next page. And so that it's kind of consistently operating to track what students are doing. And then I'm just going to talk a little bit, and this is really the last thing, is that the last thing we did was we really struggled here, and this was open-ended responses, probably the most important information we wanted to get, like how do you answer something? But it created more challenges than anything. And particularly this group of kids had a number of challenges. The first being, as soon as they see this blank page, they stop, right? It's like producing information is really a challenge for these kids, right? The other was a lot of the kids couldn't type, right? So we started to, so we have those two challenges. It's like, how do we start kids getting writing, right? Whoops. Oh, yeah, sorry. I skipped a page on my other slide. So the first thing we did, they had a hard time starting. So what did we do? We said, oh, let's start adding some kind of, they can drag vocabulary quiz into their open-ended response. And then we added sentence starters. We were like, let's add some sentence starters. The problem was we ended up with exactly what we should have expected. Everybody had the sentence starter. They wrote a little bit. They pulled in these vocabulary terms, and we knew nothing about what they actually thought. Right? What we got was what I kind of call like UDL speak. Like we just got everybody writing the same thing, which was just what we pre-programmed into the system, and we really didn't want that. So we thought, oh, let's add a note tool. And right now, this is actually pretty powerful because iOS has updated, so it'll actually, you can write by hand, and it does a really good job of transcribing this and turning it into text. So if kids are struggling with text entry, this also really works pretty well. But it didn't, it's a solution to like typing problems, but it still didn't fix that first problem. So throughout this, no matter what we tried, we just realized we were accommodating. We weren't really creating a universally designed system. We were just accommodating each discrete need, and we were ending up with kind of not very robust responses. So instead, we created what we call the movie creator. And the idea here was, if we allow kids to kind of create their own PowerPoints in the system through it that becomes sort of animated as a movie, right, we can now really hopefully see what they're actually thinking, because they don't need to write a whole response. I know that there's a lot to kind of add in here, but they can take a picture of anything they want here using the camera tool and put it in their movie. They can take any video clip that they want and put it in their movie. All of the organisms, all of the careers, it's preloaded with all sorts of information that they can also just kind of put into these movies. So they have a lot of capacity to sort of create things in here. And so I'm just going to kind of show the idea here of this movie creator, and it's kind of showing it a little bit like in a lesson how that might work, right? So this is a simulation about blue crabs in actually right up your alley over there. A big thing we looked at was the destruction of the salt marshes in Cape Cod. And so for most of our big projects like this one, we worked with a scientist. This was somebody from Brown who was kind of our expert. We have video of him. But the idea is, okay, I can work on this simulation. I can pull a picture of these crabs. I can, type, and that's going a little slow. But then right, so it now creates kind of like a slide, right? And these are somewhat controllable. Kids can, they can control the color. They can add some music. They can kind of change do they want circles or squares? But it's not like PowerPoint, because what we also noticed when we gave kids PowerPoint, they spent all their time on the look and the very little on the content. So this idea was give them a little bit of freedom, but not so much that we create a problem. So here, what you just saw is they took a picture of a graph from that simulation. Now they can put that simulation into their movie, right? So now I really don't have to kind of be online. I don't need to go find anything. It's really just kind of all integrated here. So I'll just kind of forward a little bit here. Just going to show that. And then you can see the kids can display their movies. This is actually, what you're seeing there is me not understanding how this is working. So I was trying to pull it to the side. It kind of creates its own little animations, etc. You can have music, you can add narration. So kids, through this microphone, they can narrate anything. And the system will, the length of it will be whatever the narration is. If I put a video clip in, it'll be the video clip. They can control how long the slide is. They've got pretty much universal control over that. And I just showed kind of this is just kind of another one in kind of in a STEM career, where you can see, again, it's got a little bit of, I just put some music, and it's just you can see these are, again, pictures that kids have taken. These are jobs that they can enter in here. And here's an example of putting a movie in, so they can store a movie. They can take a clip of a movie and save it and put it in here. But the idea is, like, what we got when this was happening was kids who were, here's an example now. So this is a very abbreviated lesson, but this was the first time we had kind of experience with this with kids. And this was on the wolf. I should introduce this because you'll want to read it and I shouldn't talk. one of the things we studied was like, there's a project at Yellowstone, the Wolf Project, and it looked at kind of reintroducing top predators, and it was, they kind of had some monumental findings, and all of the scientists we were working with were kind of more modern biologists who understood like the top predators were the key, not like the most, lowest level producers, right? The top predators who were kind of affected ecosystems in many ways. So we just talked about, this was an issue about the wolves are back, et cetera. And there was a attempt at the time, they were going to bring them off the endangered species list, should they? And this was just kind of the kids. So these are actual videos from the kids. And this was just a one-day activity we did with the kids. So keep the loving wolves. So again, and I've got one more, it's also short. And I show you this one because this was a kid who we had never seen participate yet. Like he hadn't participated, we never saw any work out of him. And again, these are relatively short, but so again, I think to me, the shocking thing was this was a kid we were struggling to get a word out of. And like, this was what he created. And my doc student who was working with him was just kind of like, I can't believe what came out of him. But again, I think you see here, we don't get that, like, we aren't getting stuck with, I can't do anything. You see that like his pictures help them. They can kind of move forward and kind of start to express themselves. At this time, we hadn't developed any of the simulation type things. So mostly their arguments were kind of discussion, or right, it was based on like create a good argument, use some logic, right? That sort of thing. And so I'll end here with just, this is, you can kind of watch this. This was a group of kids we actually just took out for the first time with this group of kids, just to sort of say like, this was a facility that was interested in the project. And I'll have one more picture. So we were planning to do our pilot study in end of March this past year, and we were stopped literally like a week before. It was like, this isn't going to happen. So we're in our no cost extension, fingers crossed, to do our sort of study, and hoping kind of that'll happen next. But I think this was nice because I had a couple of pictures that we were able to share. It's not from this state, it's from another state. But like, this was that same kind of look that I was, kind of pointing to in the beginning, where like we watched kids who were like engaged. And although I know it's like we're engaged with a tablet, this isn't what I typically see when I go into these settings. I don't see kids working on, they're mostly like bored, and they're going to do whatever they have, and they'll turn in their worksheet. And part of this, these kids were kind of learning this for the first time, but this kid right here, he would ask a question about like, how do I use this? We would talk to him a bit, and these kids, their tech savviness is pretty impressive. So I'm like 15 seconds, oh, okay. I'm like, oh, well, do you want us? No. And we were just showing them this. He finishes the entire book. He had made movies, he had answered every question, and he was just really proud to be done. It's, hey, can you look at my answers? And I just thought, we didn't even teach him anything. We didn't do anything. We were just there kind of sharing this. And again, just the next, the next piece, here's my doc student who's just endlessly every time we go in, he's just kind of taking notes, etc. But I just think this kind of experience, you can see here's a kid, if you can see that picture well, like he's making a movie here on that movie creator. You see a kid here is working on the simulation. So it really, just to kind of end with maybe this picture, and then I think I went a little bit over, but maybe questions or discussions. And certainly any advice you have, I think we're mostly open to, like, what are we not thinking about, etc. But thank you again. And I'm guessing you have a process to discuss. Oh, look at that. I've never seen you clapping. Where do you do that? Where do you do that?
Look at your reactions.
I've been using Zoom for like 4 years.
Reactions.
Reactions. Oh my gosh. Oh my Lord. Crying. Oh my gosh. So, okay, I'm not sure how the next part happens.
All right, now we are open to questions. Any question?
Looks like there's one in the chat box.
Yep.
Let's see.
Ken, do you want to read that one?
I have it. So I'll read it out. So it says, are textbook companies working at all to make more accessible electronic textbooks in this way? For example, a section of textbook that would have more short videos and interactive graphs than just long series of paragraphs and static pictures. So some of you may know the answer better than I. We've struggled to partner. I mean, we just, through the university, we got a lot of connections to Apple. Apple's come with kind of some pretty high level tech support around some major issues where we are struggling, to do things that, with a team mostly of undergraduate programmers, like, there's some things that we needed some help with. I think they also had these same questions around, like, it's, where is the textbook company on this, and are they interested in, from my experience working, Pearson company, which is like the largest company in this country and also the largest company in the world. I don't know the answer. I mean, I haven't seen much change. We've have some colleagues who kind of work with Pearson, but he's kind of pushed out to see if they were interested in any things we were doing, et cetera, and we haven't heard back. Their books certainly have moved more towards ebooks, so they certainly do have more things in there that are more media based. But even there, like our comparison group is that, and it's, you'll get a few maybe some graphic representations of things, like a kind of a GIF type approach. They do have some movies, but I don't think, it still seems to be heavily text oriented, right? Where for us, like, you can actually get to text. It's all behind the scenes. If I want to go read the source text to anything, I can go read it. It's just not on the front, where I think, at least still in the textbooks, it's heavy text, which again, for the kids I work with, it's just impossible. They just can't do it, right? Even having, I think you can see everything we had has a speaker so it can read for you, but when the text is complex, so many vocabulary words, it doesn't matter if it's read aloud or not. It's just outside their scope of being able to kind of comprehend from that. But I don't know if others have kind of thoughts about that.
Can I just add to that, Pat? I apologize. I know your hand was up before mine, but on that idea, yes, you're right. Pearson is starting to work on some of that, and so is Activate Learning. And there's a group that I'm working with, in addition, that is incorporating interactives into every single lesson that we write, simulations, et cetera, that go along with ebooks, but also go along with standalone curriculum that is HTML based. So it's starting to happen, and it's becoming more and more prevalent. It's a lot of work, but it's starting to come up, and it's improving, and it's becoming more accessible. And you can find some more of those kind of things. I'm also involved with NSTA, and there are a number of simulations and interactives on their lesson sites and their website. But yes, the publishers and also independent curriculum people are starting to do much more of that, and it's evolving. It's not perfect, and there's not a lot of it out there yet, but it's happening. Thank you.
Yeah, and it is, I would just agree, it's very difficult. I mean, these things, like each little thing is kind of its own whole activity. And so, you know, it to me is kind of rethinking curriculum, right? It's hard to sort of, I think we stopped sort of trying to adapt from the textbook because it was too hard. You actually had to say, let's start from the beginning, and then where does the textbook align? Because otherwise you were in a phase of trying to kind of merge things, which was even longer. At least we were thinking, oh, let's start our lessons, but it's years of work to get some of this done. So.
All right, next we have Pat. Pat raised her hand just now.
Thank you so much. This was a really inspiring presentation. I can't believe how much you've been able to get done on your project on one grant, maybe two. But I have lots of questions. I have lots of thoughts, but I think I'll just say for now, you know, your approach to, you know, get rid of the textbook, try and not have this focus on reading. I feel like this is an approach that would benefit all students in STEM and not necessarily just this specific population. So I'm curious whether there's, you know, avenues for expanding. So I think this relates to what we were just talking about. I know there's a consortium called Open Science Education. Here, I think I can put in the URL in the chat. So I think there's sort of an effort to try and round up really effective curricula in different areas. And I know one of the problems with NSF grants is that they don't fund dissemination of a really good project. So I don't have the answer to that. But yeah, I'm just curious about bringing this approach everywhere.
Yeah, well, yeah, it would be great. I you know, the only thing I can say that we did do, so when we were kind of doing a lot of beta testing, and one of the things we did was also took that to high school students, and the kind of partner school was a school out near you all. It was a very high performing school, and we took it to like the computer programming class that was like AP students taking this computer. And so we were just asking about the technology. They were doing everything they could to break things, which is really kind of a lot of what our testing is like. We call it monkey testing, like what can you do to get everything to crash? And so as our tech team was out there, and I didn't get to go on those visits, each time I would say, ask them though, like, what about just the content? Like, not, I get it, like they're working on this tech, but what do they think about the lesson? And I think that their general response was as well, like, I wish we did science this way as well. And I don't know if it's so much the text as text, but I think they said the same things that we often taught us. So much of what we read isn't related to what we're supposed to learn, right? And we just, this notion that there's an oversaturation of information that's not necessary for what the learning objective is. And I think if you kind of pull that text away, you end up with, right, really important information. And if those kids want to read more, they certainly can. So you know, that was pretty promising. I know so little about typical schools, to be honest. I've only ever worked in non-school settings. So, you know, it's often a little hard for me to kind of even kind of figure that out. I will say the one thing about being offline and the whole system being offline, We have partners in the Harvard area, the Center for Applied Special Technology, who does a lot of work, and we've partnered with them on things. Their challenge is they do all of their stuff online, and that schools also have pretty shoddy online access. And like when it goes out and when it doesn't work, their teachers are stuck with, what do I do now that like I had this whole lesson and like the internet's not working or the internet has crashed. And so that's this other side, is like if we thought about ways to have offline, and it could still be net, internet based. We've been thinking a lot about how do we kind of have stuff that you sort of download, so it's downloaded so that you can use it, but it's on your system and on your machine. And if the web goes out, it just means data sharing up and down is not happening at that time, but you can have your machine, these tablets are computers, so it's storing data on them and all of that. But I don't know. I mean, I think if we had a partner who, I think was more curricular development, we would be excited. In fact, our next project, we were hoping it would be through this go around, after we finished our pilot study, is actually to create this as a curricular development tool. So it would actually be tool sets that you create your own system. So it just gets you into like how to build this. It's the same way we do it, but we would build a kind of tool set of these systems so that you could build those.
Yeah, I think a lot of curriculum developers would love to just have access to these tools.
Yeah, and that's kind of our goal. Again, like, I work at a university. I'm not like, our university has worked pretty hard to try to figure out if they can kind of find partners, et cetera. It's not been very successful. And I don't know anything about business or anything like that. I mean, we're just working on like helping, tough kids. But, I do think, yeah, if there were partners who were interested, it certainly gives us the flexibility to say, oh, we could actually do a lot more than, in the end, we did a 6-week curriculum, which is pretty great for us, but it's like, even in a school year, right, that amounts to just a tiny part of what you should be really doing. Oh, so here's another question about the adult system. So we initially, we got a lot of requests from our, in this system, there's both a state system and then there's a county-based system where the counties have sheriffs and they have houses of corrections. So we just finished, they were really interested in the STEM career piece. And so we actually kind of catered and designed one 10 lesson unit for that, that we're actually doing our training with them next week. I think we also just submitted another grant to do a similar thing in math, where we're gonna kind of do in algebra, and our big change there is like how to do open-ended math problem solving and trying to use machine learning to help kind of identify when kids make errors and give them instantaneous feedback in the system. So they're one of our partners on that proposal. But I think, yeah, the adult system has kind of in many ways more needs, because I think at least in the juvenile system, right, there's a requirement for education. Everybody must be in education. In the adult system, it's much more voluntary. And I think if it's not engaging and interesting, a lot of the students are just not following through. And it has great applications for things like the high set here, right, which most of those students are in. And the nice thing about the high set's very contained in like what your objectives are. And it would probably be easier to try to design towards the high set as opposed to like all high school curricula, which are much more vast in scope. So translatable to Spanish speaking was another, I missed the end. So it actually is, there's actually a button on there that's I get it, we could be more accessible, but you can click there's an English Spanish button, and all of the text changes from English to Spanish. The videos that we really initially thought we could do this with the videos, it just became impossible. It was like we had to redo the videos and everything. So those videos are still in English, and we just don't, like we kind of reached the end of the line. But that was a big important piece for us, so that at least you can kind of toggle back and forth and the content is translated. we did our best. Again, I'm guessing there's probably some issues with the translation. We had a small team who was working on it and kind of trying to double check and verify, some who are native Spanish speakers, some who are bilingual native English speakers. I think that was kind of one of the more exciting. It was kind of a side project that a couple of our students were really just like, we need to do this. So yeah, it came out to be like, wow, that's really important, particularly in these settings. A lot of the kids really do, where we live, a lot of the kids are actually from Puerto Rico. A lot of them have moved here relatively late, and while they're still English speaking, Spanish is definitely the stronger language, so that if we can get them kind of, you know, engaged in this in their native language, certainly helps.
Anybody has other questions?
Can I ask another question about the pedagogy? To one of the things that I was interested in is the graph videos with the data points. So, you know, one of the things that we have a really hard time supporting students with is how to interpret and really understand what the graphs are telling you. So I was curious what sorts of supports you put in place, and, you know, whether you noticed any particular difficulties that students had with that aspect of the curriculum.
I would say it's also our biggest challenge. So we struggle, we still struggle with it. So we've kind of embedded in some kind of, there's some sort of introductory videos just about graphing. So I think there's sort of 2 or 3 as we kind of get into some more complicated graphs. We initially had thought it might be useful to do different graph types, but the reality was we were then kind of focusing on how to, you know, spread knowledge as opposed to really learning one. So we're really stuck with kind of these line graphs. There are some helpful pieces that you can always pick. So like in the graph, you can always pull up and it will help you interpret like what is happening. There's a little kind of always available kind of reminder about that, as well as the points that, you know, you can see those. There's also a helpful hint that'll tell you what that means, right? So if there's an icon, what does that mean? If, you know, what does this number mean? What does the tick mean? But it's still hard. I mean, especially, you know, the students have, not only is their science kind of depleted, but their mathematical understanding, I think their mathematical reasoning is very, it's just not, it's not easy to figure out. And across the board, it varies from kid to kid. And so I think, yeah, our kind of exploration into math actually started from that, as we thought, geez, you know, there's a really like simple, right? These are just line graphs, but understanding them is much more complicated than we anticipated. And you know, then using that, because that's a major piece of this focus, is like, okay, you need to be able to interpret and then use this as data to make a case for what you say we should do about something, right? This is how we know we should take this action. And that's been the hardest piece. And unfortunately, you know, it looks, you know, just so you know, like the teacher side of this, the teachers have their own tablets. They have these kind of mini 1-minute lessons for each day, just to kind of get them brought up to like, what are we going to do today? This is really meant to be taught, right? Like, so students are kind of working together, but there's these points. It's like, we're going to share out, everybody kind of look at me, etc. So it's not like a student learning on their own. But that's also been a struggle because the teachers also don't know. Like, you'd be shocked at how little they also understand, like how to read and interpret a graph, let alone to translate that knowledge to a student who really has a total misunderstanding of that. And I think, you know, as this was talking about, the same issues came around, misconcepts and misconceptions, and like we're fraught with that. And we've been trying to think throughout, like, when we do, you know, kind of an analogous video or trying to teach something, it has to be followed immediately with, it might seem like, right, and present the misconceptions and explain why that's not accurate. And all of that is kind of, you know, we probably missed 90% of what we should be tackling. But yeah, it's hard. The counter to that is like, the students are learning a lot more from this and are better able to kind of talk about it than they were when they just get a graph and a multiple choice question and they're told to answer it, you know, and we've seen that in our kind of testing where their responses become much more accurate and their ability to kind of explain a graph is better, but it's certainly not where you would expect it to be for, you know, a high school student by any stretch.
That's helpful. Thank you.
But do you see any the possibility of an opportunity to improve the regular educational programs in the prison, and to also train the teachers somewhat to make them better teachers?
Yeah, I think that, you know, they have the same challenges anybody has, but they're also confronted with a couple of additional problems, which is they have a longer school year, have fewer vacation days off, and their pay is lower than their comparable districts usually. So there's not a lot of incentive to kind of get people in there. And unfortunately, like, you know, the state controls all this, and they're, you know, they have the budget that they have. I think this is the primary issue. And so even, you know, it's like professional development wouldn't be sufficient. I mean, the reason we took this tact was that we just realized, like, if you actually just created a whole system that became more and more teacher proof, right? So that a good teacher could really run with this, but a teacher who really struggled could get through much better than they can now, right? And that was our kind of our approach. And I think the teachers we were working with, that's what they were saying, right? This helps me a lot more than what I currently did before, right? I can learn as we're doing this, so in ways I couldn't when I was supposed to read the textbook ahead of time and I still didn't know what I was reading. But other than saying we're going to totally reform the state system, I doubt it. And the reality is the number of kids who are in juvenile corrections keeps going down, which is great. I mean, I think that we were over incarcerating for sure. But as that happens, it becomes sort of more and more expensive per kid, right? The smaller your program gets, the more it costs per kid, because you've got healthcare, you've got clinical care, you've got security, like all of these things are all kind of playing out there. And it's the challenge in working in correctional ed. Like, it's just not education, you know, it's not like the same issue. We don't think about the same things as you would think about in a school district, right? A school board has very different challenges that they're confronting than these type of settings. But I don't know how you could reform other than sort of approaches like this. Like, if you could move everything to something like this where teachers are much more supported, I think that's kind of my sense of what's the most effective approach.